Really pleased to introduce Rocky Gregory. He's the Global Enterprise Wireless Architect at Nike, and Shannon Kurtz from the CIO office at IBM. She's responsible for their campus WLAN supporting hundreds of IBM sites globally. So thanks for joining us today, guys. Thank you for joining us, Shannon. So you participated in the IDC study. Did your team at IBM have similar findings?
Oh, definitely. So, the mean time to repair and the mean time to innocence that was mentioned, for the mean time to innocence, that was actually how we got started with 7SIGNAL. A few years back, we really focused on 100% Wi-Fi coverage. That's the primary means of connectivity. We've even been disabling our Ethernet ports so that it's the only form of connectivity. And we actually had some people out in San Francisco from an acquisition that were using Google Hangouts, which was not our normal software that we use for voice services, and complained about the awful experience. And I felt that it was with the internet egress and nothing with Wi-Fi, but their perspective is it must be Wi-Fi because that's what I connect with. And we had customers that basically refused to help us troubleshoot and said, you know what, you should really be able to find this without us answering any of your questions. We won't run any of the scripts that you want us to run on our machines. You go figure it out. And that was actually when I started looking across the marketplace for, who has a client agent that I can deploy on a client machine to collect information. And then not only that, but be able to deploy sensors to have more permanently for the entire location. And basically that's what allowed us to finally prove what we had thought is that it was actually an internet link and not Wi-Fi. But then we said, we really need to make this available more broadly. And since then, it really has, well, first of all, it actually helped us identify other issues we didn't even know existed because people weren't complaining yet, or it was just the missing VLANs that Rocky mentioned in Nike. Well, if you have a missing VLAN, it's not affecting everybody. It's really annoying people, but they're not down. And so you really have a disgruntled customer base, but you've not been able to pinpoint it. And so deploying the sensors around where we could get information from lots of different sites actually surfaced all of these things we didn't realize were happening. People weren't complaining, but it was certainly a miserable experience for them, and we were able to fix. And it was things like, the missing VLANs, or maybe there was a typo made. Maybe it was authentication services where you have 5 servers, but one of them's not working, the other 4 are, and you get that working again. Some were 5 gigahertz coverage holes where we went back and said, gee, this survey wasn't very good to begin with. Let's go, add some more access points. And so in being able to find and fix those issues before people complained or without them complaining, then we could get our people to, instead of focusing on support issues because there were things that were broken out there, we fixed them all so that we could then focus on other things, more strategic things like Rocky said, like, let's stop spending so much of our time on problem fix or interacting with clients, playing 20 questions with them before you can work on their issues to, hey, let's focus more on automation and analytics to improve our service as a whole and do more strategic things, architectural enhancements, instead of all these individual issues, because we were able to find them and fix them without having to handle them with individual customer complaints. So the return on investment is that we spend a lot less time on troubleshooting and repair, and we spend much more time on furthering our strategic initiatives and enhancing the architecture as a whole. The other thing I just wanted to point out is, aside from problems with our architecture or our configurations, or where maybe our surveys weren't great, we also used it to identify code bugs with Cisco. And in fact, we would run into a code bug and Cisco would say, oh no, it must be something wrong with your environment. We also have AT&T that provides our network support, so that when we had issues, you'd have AT&T point at Cisco, Cisco point at AT&T, sometimes get pointed back at us saying, oh, you probably didn't do a good survey. And so having this data allowed us to provide proof, wait a second, Cisco, it is changing from 20 megahertz to 40 megahertz, even though you didn't log it anywhere and you don't seem to have the capability to tell it. I've got this real evidence to prove what I'm saying. And so then they had to go, oh, this is our problem. Now we do need to fix it. We also found client driver bugs where we had older Apple devices in which they were not keeping up with the pace of new 5 gigahertz channels that countries were allowing. And so basically, you know, they would say, well, it's Wi-Fi that goes out. And then you actually are like, well, no, wait a second. You know, you're not able to connect to this one channel the country allows. That's your device. And so we've also used it to prove issues with other vendors and having to resolve that, because at the end of the day, all the client sees is I can't connect to Wi-Fi. It must be a Wi-Fi issue. So we just have a wide range of examples in which it's helped us to find issues either ahead of time or just being able to speed up. Here's where the problem is, so that we can work with that other group to actually fix it.
Yeah, Shannon, you brought up a lot of important points there. Certainly when working with an AP vendor to try to establish that there's a software bug or a hardware issue with an AP, that can be really challenging. You might have to provide over-the-air packet captures and you know, do continuous monitoring to be able to discover something that's an intermittent issue. And you know, having the right tools in place can really make that an easier process. Another point I thought was interesting, and I think a lot of our customers have this experience too, is with Mobile Eye and Sapphire Eye deployed, they start discovering, you know, smaller issues that cause some, you know, pain and grief for end users, but they haven't quite crossed that threshold yet where they're going to call the help desk and, you know, be willing to engage in that process of troubleshooting with the help desk. So you might discover issues you didn't know were there that people are just simply tolerating, and be able to get those resolved for everyone's benefit. Shannon, I wanted to follow up though, interesting point during Mark's presentation about automation tools. You shared what you guys are doing with Ansible. So would you mind maybe sharing that live?
I guess I don't have anything I can really share to this screen right now, but with our focus on the automation and the analytics is, so we've created a very large, it's 9 or 10 terabytes now, where we are actually trying to collect information from all of our tools and store it in a database so that we can analyze it to identify issues. We build some of our own health dashboards or some of our own rules to alert us. And so we're using Ansible for a couple things. One is we want to log into all of our devices and collect some information about those devices. So, you know, one is, hey, if security came to us and said, there's a suspicious device, here's the MAC address or IP, we can go back and tell all the different places that it was connected to in our network. We also want to start storing and backing up our configurations so that we can start analyzing all of them to make sure they all comply with the global template, because we are very much into standard global templates. And so the first step is collecting all of those, making sure things comply. And then what we want to use Ansible for is, now every time there's a new deployment, let's take the standard template, let's take these variables that are specific to that site or country or region to put into that template to then push the config to the device. And we use mainly Cisco in the campus, and now that they have iOS XE out, it allows you to do that automated config, whereas the previous iOS was very proprietary and very difficult with Ansible for lots of different reasons. It was just made it very difficult. So now with iOS XE, we're going to be able to do that. So we're looking first to do that with Ansible, because previous to that, we had looked at scripting it a few different ways, and Ansible just has so many playbooks already developed by other people out there that you can pretty much find where somebody else has done what you're trying to do, and then you just kind of manipulate it for what you need. Now, one of the things with being a Cisco shop is we are still figuring out how that's going to integrate with DNA, because Cisco is going to tell you, oh, use DNA for full automated config management. But we've kind of learned from the past is you've got to be careful of how much you rely on something proprietary and you're so dependent on that vendor. So my preference is let's use Ansible playbooks in our database, but we can use perhaps DNA as the vehicle, because I know a lot of the Cisco products, like with the previous Prime, it's kind of a database under the covers you can't get to. And we very much need to store things in a database we can access, because then we can extract it from that database as we write more AI and automation and tooling. Now, we are a big, IBM's big with AI. So not every company is going to want to build their own database and do all of this. So, I think there's probably different products to fit, different categories and groups. But because we do have our own database we're developing and a lot of our own AI on top of that, it's important to us to have that capability to extract and store that in our own database and not in, another vendor's product. So then the key is around the integration and the APIs. And so that's another thing with 7SIGNAL and Mobileye we've been talking to 7SIGNAL about is, hey, you guys also offer APIs, because eventually there's some data from Mobileye and from Sapphire that I'm also going to want to store in that database so that I can compare it to other things to even, alert me ahead of time to when there's potential issues. And so 7SIGNAL has that capability, and it's kind of on our to-do list to look at next to start pulling into that database.
Yeah, Shannon and Rocky, this is Mark here. I'm always, and it's very easy to get wrapped up in the technology here, and these solutions offer us so much leverage to better run our networks and such. I'm very interested on the services side of the fence and what suppliers do besides just provide you technology solutions. Is, when you look at your own implementation and where you are, and even onboarding originally to where you are now and trying to do even more things with the 7SIGNAL product. And you'll see a roadmap next, I hear from Simon as well. So from that standpoint, what are the service related things that 7SIGNAL do that really help you move faster, leverage their product even more so than what you would do on your own? And I know that networking people are highly self-reliant, as you heard by the examples with Shannon doing a lot of Ansible work and their own database and all that stuff. But the kind of things that 7SIGNAL have done to help you along the way.
Go ahead, Shannon.
Yeah, so we were seeing the same thing. The coaching on technology is a good one. With the dashboards, if there's something where something doesn't look right, we're not sure how to interpret it, or want some ideas, the sales engineer, the systems engineers helped us, and well, here's the possible things, or here's us looking at the data, what we think, and helping train our people on how to understand those. And then I also have to tell you that 7SIGNAL has been very receptive when we've come to them saying, hey, if you added this feature or you collected this other piece of data, it would really help us. Or, hey, we really need SSO into your dashboard. And so they've been very receptive and incorporated, quite a few of the things we asked for into their newer releases. That doesn't just benefit us, but that's one thing is they do look and say, well, gee, this could actually benefit everybody. And then they've taken things even 10 steps beyond what we suggested. And when they looked into it, said, oh, and if we did that and that and that. They've also been very receptive into that. The webinars have been wonderful. And also just tying in, now the sensor information and the Mobileye agent information and taking that further. Because at the end of the day, we have all these other tools that tell us information, but they don't give us the end user experience. And really, with the 7SIGNAL tools, this is the only way to understand and measure the end user experience without having to talk to each end user individually. And so translating, that experience into, okay, what does that mean? What could be the areas in our network that could be contributing to that? They've helped us greatly in understanding and tying everything together.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. And really appreciate both Rocky and Shannon mentioning our customer success and support teams. They really do a great job. Appreciate that. Why don't we transition to a question more around budgets? How are you justifying the 7SIGNAL spend in your budget at Nike?
So usually ours is we have to kind of get the regional buy-in. So, we deployed it at the first few locations, and that's where we uncovered all kinds of things we didn't know what were going on. So it was like, yep, this was a great investment. Now we need to deploy this across all of our regions. And so we had quite a few regions that were like, well, why does money need to come out of my budget for this? Maybe I don't want this in my region. And that's when we've actually been keeping a PowerPoint presentation of every time we find a problem, we do screen captures to describe what the problem was and plop it in this presentation. So every time a region would say, why do I need this? Like, well, let us show you. Hey, look, we had this problem. We could see it on the dashboard. We fixed it all without a customer complaining. Hey, look at this very complicated problem. And then within 30 minutes of looking at the data, we were able to pinpoint it. So we were able to give them real world examples. And then on top of that, we've also said, we're now going to have a pilot code program where anytime we certify new Wi-Fi code, which everybody does have to adopt within 3 months, we will have a pilot period. If you want a site to participate in that pilot period so you can see it works no problem, you have to have sensors there so that during that pilot, we apply the new code. We look at the sensor data so we can tell you, look, we applied it in your region. From an end user perspective, no problem. And we tell them they do have to have a few sites in each region as part of this pilot program. And so 7SIGNAL has to be a part of that. And then also, if they want advanced support from our teams, because you have your level 1, level 2 help desk or whatever, if they want advanced support from our team in key locations, like there's manufacturing, or maybe there's a giant customer briefing center, or you have lots of executives sit, we basically tell them, you have to have these sensors there so that we have the data at our fingertips. We have historical data. We can see trends. We can see what's going on. And then if you have problems, you have our advanced support group that can step in and look and evaluate. And so when we share all of that with them, they'll buy in and say, oh, I can see, you show me demonstrated examples, and I now have the comfort of I have this data in which I'm going to have really smart people, be able to look at it, experienced people, and tell me if my site is healthy or not and pinpoint.
Yeah, great. That's an excellent way to help make that business case. So Rocky, question for you, and Shannon, I'd love to hear your input on this too, but how has 7SIGNAL continued to play a role through the COVID-19 pandemic? Is this part of your larger business continuity plan? And is remote work at Nike and at IBM here to stay?
So we don't support the people's home networks, but because there have been less people on site, we've actually been using this period to try to accelerate certifying new platforms. So we've been certifying the new Wi-Fi 6 access points, the embedded wireless controller functionality, the new iOS XE code. So the sensors have been great because we can't have as many people on site doing the testing. We have a few people that can go on site. So it's like, hey, this site hardly anyone's going at. Let's go upgrade the new code. Let's put these new platforms in. And then from home, as we apply new code and settings, we can look at the net effect. So that what we're trying to do is this period in which people aren't home is let's make the Wi-Fi even better. So when they do come back, and I think they will come back, that it's better than when they left it. And now we also have more capabilities. Now, I think when people do come back, it may not be as concentrated, but the thing with Wi-Fi is you still have to have complete coverage. You maybe don't need to have as dense access points, but we still need to provide the same coverage footprint. And so again, those measurements from the end user perspective are going to help us figure out, do we have it right, or are there some places we need to go fix? And we've also been using this to test new settings and new code, which leads us to other places. Even though there may be some places people don't return, your manufacturing, that's still going to happen. We're still going to have large customer briefing centers. So it's also focusing this work in the areas in which we know there will be continued work going on. And by the way, we're already seeing the people return to the sites in Asia Pac, because we do measure that quite closely with our analytics. So we know all the sites people are returning to, and we're already seeing that in Asia Pac. We're seeing that some in the Nordic countries as well. And as they do, we're also having to use some of the mobile eye and some of the sensors we just send around to problem areas to troubleshoot as they return.
Yeah, Shannon, I think that's a pretty common customer experience. At least that's some of the feedback I've heard. Buildings are empty, sites are available. So this is a great time to do AP refreshes, hardware refreshes, take maintenance windows during normal business hours and get things upgraded and installed before people start coming back.
Yeah.
Next question, and Mark, I'd love to hear your input on this one in general for what you're hearing around the industry, but we'll ask Shannon and Rocky this as well. But what's 7Signal's role in the larger infrastructure plans for 2021 and beyond? We've heard from IDC and others that spending is being diverted from refreshing and expansion to productivity and monitoring. So Mark, any comment before we go to Shannon and Rocky?
I found it, I'll liken it to Shannon's experience that she's doing, the concentration on finding out a lot more about what's going on in her network. And I liked, you talked about this movement where you're seeing AP tick up in terms of activity on the network. So that's like an indication of how that visibility can really affect how you operate. And obviously, everyone, as bad as COVID has been, for a lot of folks, there are some advantages to it. The buildings are empty. It is time to upgrade. It is time to do things. And obviously, if you're freeing up people from having to diagnose work from home problems, suddenly they can look at new technologies and do upgrades and optimize the existing network. These are all significant advantages that pay a lot of dividends down the road. And those are things that I must say, even in our ROI studies, those are more some of the softer justifications that you hear from people that they may not have data. They don't have data on how does that make the business more nimble, because there isn't a return yet for it. But undoubtedly, in this digital world, being successful is about being nimble and being ready and being able to adopt new applications onto your network at a moment's notice without generating suddenly a lot more trouble tickets and things. So, people don't put a price on that, but that is a major gain if, again, your network is far more ready to do things. And that has to do with infrastructure spending as well. I mean, and you look at a lot of the new infrastructure spending, a lot of people were doing the same old prior to COVID. And they're realizing that networks need to be far more dynamic and elastic. And that's leading them to examine more of the technologies that allow for greater flexibility and elasticity. I talked about the cloud uptick that we're seeing from people, but also, that movement towards a more mobile workforce, an emphasis on Wi-Fi. Are we going to, in new sites, are we going to run the LAN switch anymore and run a wire to everyone's desktop, everyone's desk space? Well, the reality is, does anyone have a desk space anymore? I mean, these are all things that are to be worked out. One of the subjects of our study was a major office furniture manufacturer, and they have all kinds of different layouts for customers to view in terms of how they want their offices to look like. And in there, it was all about wireless. No one's worried about running cables to every place. And so from that perspective, Wi-Fi is the dominant connectivity. So that becomes a major factor in terms of AP capacities and surveys and how you're laying things out, and contention across wireless and security, segmentation. I mean, all of those things start to pop up as wireless becomes the dominant structure that we're connecting to. And that has a lot to do with new technologies like a 5G, where we're seeing a lot of activity, especially in the service provider space. And this is causing the service providers to be a lot more aware of what's running across their network. They've been looking for ways of adding value besides just selling bandwidth and circuits forever and ever. But those bandwidth and circuits were fairly staid and static, and they ran from point A to point B. And so they were pretty easy to kind of keep track of. And hey, you ran just, that's why we ran all that dark fiber. So it's easy to just turn some new ones on. Well, in the 5G world, it's very different in terms of network designs and the things you have to worry about, capacity planning. And again, being able, and service providers are always looking to add value on top of selling bandwidth or even wireless connections. So from that perspective, service providers are really investing a lot in analytics and trying to understand, again, how the networks are running and how they can monetize the services that they're presenting to end users. And remember, 5G is not only something that's being promoted as a wide area network component, it is also being promoted as a local area network environment as well. So from that perspective, a lot of those things that apply in a Wi-Fi 6 environment, older Wi-Fi environment, those things are going to translate into the private 5G networks. And they will also translate across the larger spectrum in the wide area network for 5G as well. And SD-WAN is another technology that I think of with the flexibility that it provides for remote branches. Maybe it's a remote branch of one. When we do maybe roll out enterprise networking gear into people's homes, you saw some announcements by Spectrum and Cisco recently where they're offering a package where somebody gets a Cisco device that's basically a corporate device that they're putting inside of their home network. And the flexibility of SD-WAN products, the whole issue of being software defined, enables that product and that technology to be more flexible. That has to be driven by data and analytics and all those decisions that are made as a result of that to form the SD-WAN so that it's performing up to snuff, depending on what the user's requirements are in those locations.
Yes, so both Mark and Rocky touched on a few things the same as us. The SDN, the software-defined networking. So, I mentioned before we have these pilot sites where we test new code upgrades, but as we move to SDN, which we are in the WAN and campus, we're going to get to the point that we're going to just start making changes at a push of a button a lot more frequently. And we really need, and we're not going to have schedule up on-site testers every time. So that's where it's really important that when we make a change, what data do we have from the site, from the end user experience that confirms whatever we just did didn't negatively impact it, especially when these changes, as we're more agile, are going to be more frequent, smaller changes more frequent, instead of where we came from our old waterfall method where once a year we'd apply new code and whatever template updates. So SDN bringing about those more frequent changes really relies on what do you have out there that gives you immediate data feedback on whether it was successful or not. And then also with the mention of 5G, real estate and security are starting to use a lot of other technologies for IoT devices. And so they're wanting to deploy a lot more of their endpoints on different networks. And we need to make sure that those don't interfere. And in fact, we found at some sites where I think it was Zigbee, since it uses some of the 2.4, that we were actually seeing interference. And it was probably us interfering with theirs, but they need their network up and running as well. And so as IoT becomes more predominant and there's more IoT devices, it's, how do you assess the health of everything and even help other people that you might be impacting their network as well to share information. The analytics and automation, that the APIs and pulling data so we can do more analytics, that's key for us as we move into 2021. As Wi-Fi 6E comes about with more channels, we're apt to run into problems again where, hey, this country allows more channels. We now support more channels. If there's clients having problems connecting, maybe it's their device driver or something like that. So with Wi-Fi 6E, we'll probably be relying quite a bit on the data we get from the sensors and then from the Mobileye agent. And then we've also been talking to 7SIGNAL about, hey, we've been using the Mobileye agent to look at one specific user's information and data to maybe troubleshoot. But what we actually want to do is start silently pushing the client in an anonymized fashion to feed us data so that we can see general trends. So, hey, are we seeing Apple notebooks with a certain driver or adapter that maybe their performance isn't as great, or when they released whatever their new OS level is, we're seeing their MCI index go down or something like that. So that's something else we're looking to do is how do we deploy the Mobileye agent across a larger scale of client machines just to tell us trends versus, individual client information. So that's another focus for us in 2021.
Shannon, maybe one last question here from the audience. Here's a question. I work in a university environment with students coming from many different countries. How big is a problem of mobility with the 5 gigahertz experience using Wi-Fi devices from one regulatory domain to another?
So, it's not as much of a problem as it used to be. And that also goes back to where we've kind of engaged with the different regions. And we said, you have to have sensors in different regions. That was another, hey, we need to make sure we have sensors monitoring Wi-Fi in which the access points operate under different regulatory domains. So and it's not as much of a problem. We also are very much into global standards and ensuring that when you walk into, say, the IBM site in Taiwan, the access points are the same model. They follow the same Wi-Fi survey as every other country. They're running the same code level and that standard configuration template as, say, our site in California. But even with that, I mentioned before in Malaysia, we had an issue where the country allowed an addition of a channel. And even 2 years later, there were still older MacBooks because they couldn't apply the change to a device driver. It was embedded into the adapter. It just, didn't work. So we still run into them once in a while, but it's not nearly as prevalent as I think it was a few years ago, especially now that Wi-Fi is the primary form of connectivity. I think that the laptop, the adapter makers, the driver makers or writers, they're all keeping up with the latest standards and realize they can't go lax, that they have to be maintaining their hardware and driver levels and our access point vendors to the latest that are out there. I think when 6E is released, which adds more channels, I think that's when there's the potential to see again, hey, this access point supports these 6E channel sets, but maybe this laptop doesn't. And that's, how we kind of deal with that is we still have 2.4, but we tell people we don't support 2.4. It's there for some really old stuff, but if you call into us with a problem, we're going to help you get working on 5 gigahertz. And so we actually had to work with our client teams when we started instituting that to actually push out the latest driver that supports 5 gigahertz, push the setting in which you prefer 5 gigahertz. So that's something we'll do within our corporation, is not just deploy access points that support 6E, but we'll also work with our client teams to make sure they're pushing out the settings so that the clients do support and use that. But what will be difficult is when you have customers come in that don't, and that's why we still have the 2.4 around and haven't disabled that everywhere. So we all also have to be mindful of being able to support some of those older technologies until they are more prevalent across the board.
It's like an ongoing challenge. Well, I really want to thank Shannon and Rocky for joining us on our customer panel, and Mark for your input too. And with that, I'll swing it back to you, Don.
Thanks a lot, Jim. Shannon and Mark and Rocky, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.